Hello, El Paso, and welcome to the Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera Student Edition podcast. My name is Jared Mendy. I've been working with Dr. Kim Diaz and Dr. Jules Simon on Philosophic Dialogues for the past year, and we're very happy to welcome Dr. Ronald J. Weber with us here today to talk about mythology. Dr. Ronald J. Weber is an associate professor of ancient history and humanities and the director of the Humanities program and the Master of Arts in Interdisciplinary Studies program at the University of Texas at El Paso. His research interests focus on the history of ancient Rome, and he teaches courses on ancient Rome, Greece, and the Middle East, and the impact of classical Roman culture in the United States. Since 2002, Dr. Ronald Weber has led a yearly 2-week study abroad trip to Rome and central Italy. An article on his successes and pedagogies when leading students in study abroad trips was in the summer 2019 issue of Interdisciplinary Humanities. His current research focuses on the history and evolution of the city of Rome and its place as a center of world culture. A book chapter on Lady Elizabeth Foster, Duchess of Devonshire, and her sponsorship of excavations in the Roman Forum will be published later this year in the book With Italy as Their Muse, British Women Travelers in the Long 19th Century, 1815 to 1918. He is currently the executive editor of Interdisciplinary Humanities, the Journal of the Humanities Education and Research Association. He has written about the Roman family Caeonius in Albinus, the living memory of a 5th century personality, in the journal Historia, and published work on the Roman historian Livy in Collection Latimus. Dr. Ronald Weber, it's really great to have you on here. Thank you for coming.
Oh, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad you reached out to me to talk with you.
I wanted to talk with you about mythology. Because mythology has always fascinated me, and with your research into like Rome and Greece, I wanted to know some of your takes on the way that mythologies from different cultures can influence each other. And my first question is pretty general. My first question is, what is mythology?
Oh God, that's a vast topic itself. As I encounter it, mythology oftentimes extends into history. It deals with issues of memory and historical memory and historical preservation and so forth. So it's a vast topic. I don't claim to be an expert on the totality of mythology at all. Where it interests me and where it comes into my teaching deals largely with the origins of mythology in the ancient Middle East and in Egypt, two fascinating areas of mythological creation and development, and with the later Greek adaptations upon Mediterranean and Middle Eastern mythologies itself. One of my great regrets is that Bruce Loudon, a former professor here at UTEP, has passed away, and he would be a fascinating individual to discuss this topic with, for example. He worked primarily in comparative literature. But my interest is, as I said, primarily Mediterranean, and ancient Middle Eastern itself. In that context, mythology as it's created is really created in a indigenous set of individuals who are largely agriculturally dependent, and the way it shapes is they are actually very much in contact with nature itself. They live in nature, they live with nature, they live as part of nature. And so the stories that they tell to explain and investigate their world have to do with their relationships with nature itself. And in that case, they are mostly spontaneous and differ from place to place. Egyptian mythology, while it resembles, especially formative Egyptian mythology, as it resembles Middle Eastern mythology, is similar to Mesopotamian mythology, yet in each particular case, they take their own different tract in telling their stories, creating their stories, interpreting their stories, and so forth. And what we usually think of as Greek mythology itself is really, truly not true mythology in the sense that it's not spontaneous. It's edited and revised and adapted to in Greek in a fashion which is Greek rationality. The Greeks rationalize the myths that they absorb out of Egypt and the Middle East itself. So in many ways, it's not true mythology anymore. It's borders on history, folklore, literature, because we encounter it largely in literature itself. So it's not really truly mythology anymore in that sense. So I see mythology as something spontaneously generated in these areas by largely indigenous agricultural people in the early years of civilization and the development of civilization, in many cases before even the development of cities.
That's a really fascinating perspective, and I haven't actually heard it like coined like that. Would you say, since we're not in necessarily an agricultural society anymore, would you say that there is any such thing as mythology like in the modern day, or is that no more?
Individuals have individual ways of spontaneously generating their own explanations of various things. However, in my view, they are so highly refined based upon such extensive backgrounds and experiences and so forth, that they're not the same sort of thing that you see evolving among primitive agricultural peoples. They're not as spontaneous, nor are they as widespread as ancient mythologies were.
Okay.
You know, to give you an example, for example, in Egypt and in Mesopotamia, with these stories were the results of individual encounters with their life in isolated areas and very individual, in which they responded to the things that life foisted upon them and tried to develop ways to explain their origins in ways. And in these primitive stages, one of the differences between them and a lot of Greek mythology is there's more spontaneous reactions, and they contain oftentimes one of these, a divine element. These forces that they encounter, this life that they encounter, is just prolific with all sorts of things, all sorts of divine type forces existing in them. The Greeks, on the other hand, tended to sort of rationalize those divine forces into something very anthropomorphic, which was actually working toward a kind of general explanation of the rationality of existence.
Talking about divine forces, that leads me to my next question. So how would you differentiate mythology from religion?
In the early stages, it was actually, you could probably actually see it as a part of religion, in fact, a kind of religious expression, as it were. In our present day, the things that we utilize that have some sort of mythological origin, and I think largely of the Bible, because the Bible is also generated in the ancient Middle East itself. The stories that occur in the Bible have, over the course of eons, of millennia, been revised, edited, commented upon, changed, and so forth, so that they are highly rationalized to fit evolving theological explanations going forward from all of that. So mythology appears in religion itself. It's used as an explanation and of causative factors to a certain extent, But in my view, it's not really true mythologies anymore because it's been so highly edited and rationalized over the course of centuries.
I see. Okay. And that also talking about how even if it's not true mythology anymore, the way that it's influenced, those spontaneous generations continue to influence us. What role does or did mythology play in culture, especially maybe both in the cultures that it first arose in and in later cultures?
It played a role as a formative factor and an explanatory factor within society itself. In Egypt and the ancient Middle East, besides being an explanation of the causatory elements of existence itself, over the course of time, these explanations were used as a way to understand such things as the order of the universe, the relationship of man to the universe, the relationship of man to man itself. And so in that sense, mythologies played a role in the formation of such things as laws going forward, the organization of civic institutions and so forth. It played a role in all of that in the same way that those stories that we find in the Bible, particularly the Old Testament itself, still play a role in the way in which people try to interpret such things as the relationships between people, law, and so forth. It's part of the ongoing debate about whether the Ten Commandments are relevant, whether they are religious or whether they are civil manifestations of law. And so you have these court battles over whether the Ten Commandments should be monumentalized in front of courthouses and so forth. And so this is a way in which these ancient stories themselves are still a part of the life that people live in the what we are now, the 21st century, with this. So there's still part of us that are this. We historians tend to think of these things in terms of, and the terms that are used are such things as historical memory, for example. Those social patterns, thoughts, expectations that become a part of society going forward and are simply seemingly, in many cases, sort of spontaneously regenerated from generation to generation. It's a way in which history continues to evolve and to remain a part of our life. History isn't the past. History is actually the present in those cases. And as part of that present are these stories that are told coming forward. And there's all sorts of attempts to explain them. I mean, as memory, as folklore, as mythologies, all sorts of different things, but they're all part of the dynamic of society and the intellectual part of society. You as philosophers deal with that all the time.
Yeah, and I've noticed, especially because like I'm as a philosophy major, there's both a tendency in me to, when I read like mythology and stuff, to try to interpret it in some kind of symbolic way, but then also in a sense it can't really fully be interpreted. And that's not what the myth is necessarily there for.
Right. And the generation of the myth has its own context, and in its own context, it has that purpose. But as it comes forth into different contexts, and those contexts themselves all have their own purpose for bringing this forward, and they interpret it within their own context going forward. And so mythology is really, as I see it, quite dynamic. It's not static at all in the way in which it's used, in the way in which it's interpreted, and so forth. And I'm quite interested in the way in which others tend to see historical stories or historical mythologies and so forth coming forward. How do they use them? Why do they use them in the way they do?
Yeah. That probably, there's a lot with that both in the way that Greece borrowed from Mesopotamia and the way that Rome borrowed from Greece, and constantly reinterpreting those mythologies into something new and more rationalized, maybe a little more rigid.
Right, right. The Romans were great copyists, so they really didn't do much with Greek rationalization of mythologies. The ones who really took on mythology and began to fashion it in a different way was Christianity. Now, granted, Christianity was a Roman religion in that sense, but when Christianity came upon the scene itself, they're the ones who really changed the Greek approach to mythology, not by rejecting it. Christianity didn't reject Greek mythologies or Greek rationalism. It adopted and adapted it. And that's where the real change started to come about.
Kind of like even in the Middle Ages, they would use some of Virgil's poetry in like the Mass, and then even some. It's also like when the monks would go to like the Nordic or the Celtic countries, they would reinterpret their mythologies in a way that like fit in a way with the biblical stories. And so Irish monks said that like the first settlers to Ireland were like these children that were the children of Noah that weren't named, Right. And so it's kind of like, and then their descendants become the Irish gods.
Right. Yeah.
It's really interesting.
Yeah. And this is an attempt to rationalize these sorts of things, which was by that time very much a church doctrine, since people like the writer Eusebius, for example, and Augustine and so forth, started viewing church doctrine, church theology, as not a new creation, but as a continuous, ongoing evolution of the realization of God in the world. And that mythology was actually a part of this, a preliminary step in all of this. In some ways, this is very Platonic, basically Platonic in the way in which they approached it and so forth. But it's a continuation. It's not a break from the mythological past.
Mm-hmm. That also brings me to another question, because you talked about how every mythology, when it spontaneously arises in a certain kind of locale, is drawn really from the people in that environment. And so there's something very particular about every mythology to the culture it's in.
Yes, right.
But
right.
Would you say that there are features that are the same across them? Because of course there are famous writers like Jung or Campbell who write about like archetypes and how it's all one myth. Or would you say yes or no, or more nuance to that?
I tend to see much more nuance to it than they wanted to see, all of that, because I think in one way, mythology is very personal. It's taken on by each individual in each individual's own way. And if we still emphasize individuality, we recognize individualities as having individual context, individual experiential backgrounds, and so forth, individual environment, and so forth. All of that, I think, goes into the way in which each individual reacts to myth, historical stories, folklore, historical memory, and those things. All of that affects it. So it's very, very personal to the individual. And so in that sense, it lends me to have less confidence in the idea of archetypes, as it were. I tend to gravitate more to an acceptance of strands of similarities within themes of so forth, themes of growing and coming of age, for example, which is a common theme that you see in all sorts of different stories, both mythological, novels, movies, and so forth, that sort of thing. ultimate questions about origins. I think everyone always asks a question about their own origins, personal identities, to all of that. And so each individual kind of goes at those things and makes those interpretations about identity and origin based upon the way in which and the background from which they come to each individual story. Now, if you want to call those individual stories archetypes, go ahead. I think that's largely a matter of terminology.
Okay.
It's there. I'm not as the thing with Jung and with Freud particularly is, for me, they were always too deterministic in their archetypes. Their archetypes were much more demanding and impositional upon people, and not as open to interpretation as I tend to look at them.
Mm-hmm. I've kind of noticed that too. When I haven't read a lot of Freud, but when I've read Jung or Joseph Campbell, I've noticed that it's a little almost too strict. Trying to fit things in too many boxes when it is really personal, especially mythology.
Right. And, to a certain extent, they're really approaching this from a very sort of Greek way, because Greek rationalism was more concerned with the understanding of the order of things and the way in which the order of things determined them and the way in which they evolved. And there tends to be in this type of reasoning a kind of rigidity, I think, and a certain amount of a blind spot for this. They're so intent upon determining that ordered outcome that they at times ignore other things that they come upon as they proceed.
Mm-hmm.
Henry Frankfurt, for example, who was a great interpreter of Egyptian mythology, for example, takes this sort of view. He's very critical of Greek rationalism in all of that. He doesn't take on very much. I think he could. He doesn't take on Campbell or Jung or Freud that much, but he tends to oppose Greek rationalism, the rigidity of Greek rationalism.
Mm-hmm.
Itself, and just the sort of unerring, unmoving, rigid approach to proving an outcome, regardless of how you're getting there.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of ignoring things as you go along.
Yeah.
You see that to a certain extent with Aristotle, for example. He's got this goal he seems to be going for, and choosing the things that he wants to utilize to getting to that goal, and sometimes ignoring others, even contradicting himself in different places, for example, to get there.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is all interesting discussion material itself, and mythology is a part of that. I think it's a big part of the rationality and irrationality of mankind. We're complex individuals. We're rational at points, but we also have our terrible irrationalities.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And also it's the topic of the kind of weird border between philosophy and mythology is one that we could talk about for so long. So I wanted to get back though to talking about how mythologies are based on their locale and kind of native. You said they're indigenous. Would you say that there's a big difference between mythologies that are culturally isolated or mythologies that involve a lot of syncretism? So maybe cultures that have been separated from other cultures and cultures that have been mingling with each other?
I see the mingling of cultures as really the kind of basic eroding and changing of mythology. That real mythology, pure mythology, is for the most part fairly isolated, and when it loses its isolationism, for example, among the Middle Eastern peoples, when Middle Eastern and Egyptian, including the Egyptian mythologies, began to change, was when the societies themselves began to divorce more and more of their population from a direct involvement in nature, when peasants and farmers were, for various reasons, moved off of the land itself because of increases in population, increases in urbanization itself, and there was a greater distance created between them and their daily involvement with nature and the land and so forth. Their mythologies began to change at that particular point in time. So there was a distance between that original creation of explanations and the explanations that now became necessary for them as they became more diversified, more urbanized, more in contact with individuals from other regions, and then ultimately with individuals from even outside of their own geographical designations itself, as Egypt and Mesopotamia began to mingle together. And you see some of that conflict of mingling in the Old Testament, in the Exodus stories, where you have Hebrew Jewish ideas conflicting with Egyptian ideas, and even melding with one another to a great extent going forward. So that's a real change in mythologies. And according to Frankfurt, that's really kind of that really begins the deterioration of true mythology.
That's a really, I've really loved your perspectives, Dr. Weber. I have just one last question, and it's more of a fun one. Do you have a favorite, mythology, or a favorite myth, like a favorite culture's myth, or?
Being a classicist, I tend to gravitate not so much to stories as to particular works of literature. For example, I'm a great admirer, for example, of Homer, particularly his Iliad. With this, although the Odyssey is a great story. Among the Romans, I'm fascinated by Virgil's Aeneid. I don't think Virgil's as great a poet as Homer, but he's fascinating in the sense in which he formulated an approach and an idea and an identity that was so influential for so long within Roman society, and then was the identity that was then picked up, particularly in the Renaissance. I mean, without Virgil, Dante wouldn't have written his Inferno. Without Inferno, there wouldn't be an Italian language, and the Italian Renaissance would be a whole lot different than it really is, and it really ended up being, for example. So Virgil had such a tremendous impact upon that. So I tend to gravitate toward those pieces of literature, those grand stories that these very creative writers were able to compose and so forth, express these things in ways that were just so powerful that they just don't go away. For example, there are writers down through history who were just that influential, that formative. Virgil, Dante, Shakespeare, they just were able to do something with words that others just couldn't. And I tend to gravitate that way. And so the stories of Homer and the stories of Virgil, basically because I'm an ancient historian as well. I mean, I granted that my background and training influences me strongly in all of this, just utilize these strong mythological tales itself and had such an effect as a result of that. Just to give you an example, I don't think by the time Virgil's Aeneid came out in the period at the beginning of the Roman Empire, most well-informed Romans actually believed that was the way in which Rome was founded. But it just created such a powerful identity that they couldn't let it alone. They just had to deal with it in one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
And it's even questionable. I mean, the story goes that Virgil even instructed that when he died, that his poem be destroyed, and the Emperor Augustus just refused to do that. And in my experience, there's no historical figure that's more cynical and manipulative than the Emperor Augustus was. And it's not that he believed in it, but he just saw this as such a strong identity-building story that he just couldn't let it go.
Yeah. I had never heard of that with Virgil. That's really fascinating, Dr. Weber. We're gonna have to wrap up, but thank you so much, Dr. Weber. I really appreciated talking with you about mythology and cultures and all of that. It's been awesome. And thank you everyone for joining us. Please join us again next time for Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera.